All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Rural Grocery Succession Planning Monthly Webinar. We are just going to get started in a few minutes, but while we wait for folks to log on, just go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from and what is your connection to rural grocery. And we will get started in just another minute. All right, well, it is 1:30, so we can go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome to the Rural Grocery Succession Planning Monthly Webinar Series. My name is Erica Blair. I am a program manager for the Rural Grocery Initiative, which is a unit within K-State Research and Extension. We work with communities across Kansas and across the nation to support locally owned rural grocery stores. So thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to be talking about various ways municipalities can partner with their local grocery stores to ensure a smooth transition and encourage development of grocery stores in their communities. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So before we dive into today's webinar, I want to just give a little background information. This webinar series is a continuation of the series we hosted in 2021 called Keeping Groceries Alive. So please go ahead and check out that webinar series for additional resources and case studies related to succession planning. In this webinar series, which we have been hosting roughly every month throughout 2022, we are highlighting various resource providers who can help you through this process. We're identifying key succession planning considerations and presenting various options and sharing examples of real-world grocery ownership transitions. So to find additional resources on this topic, please visit www.ruralgrocery.org. Before we begin, we also want to thank our sponsor, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, for making this webinar series possible. And then finally, I have some quick housekeeping items. So this webinar is being recorded and you can find all the previous recordings at ruralgrocery.org under the events tab. And then we also will have time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions during the presentation, please ask them in the Q&A box. You can also ask your questions and share comments in the chat box as well. All right, so with all of that being said, we're ready to dive in. Again, today's topic is grocery-municipal partnerships. Grocery stores are critical infrastructure in rural communities. So when a grocery ownership transition takes place, city and county leaders are often very invested in helping retain that business. Municipalities have access to various tools and resources, so we will be discussing what that might look like today. In a previous webinar in the Keeping Groceries Alive series, we highlighted a municipally owned grocery store in Erie, Kansas. We have also written a success story on a municipally owned grocery store in St. Paul, Kansas. So we will provide a link in the chat so that you can access those resources. Because we've already previously covered the municipally owned grocery ownership model, we won't be talking about that model today. However, we will be focusing on various economic development incentive tools that municipalities might consider. And Sarah Steele with Gilmore and Bell will be walking us through those options. And then we will hear a real-world example from Cole Herter, the city administrator of Humboldt, Kansas, to learn how their municipality supported their local grocery store in other important ways. So I will provide a link in the chat so that you can read the bios of our two incredible speakers today. And without further ado, I will now turn it over to our first presenter, Sarah Steele.
Thank you, Erica. I will introduce myself. I'm Sarah Steele with Gilmore & Bell. I work in the Wichita office of Gilmore & Bell. Our law firm is a municipal finance firm. That is what we have focused on for 40 years. And so I'm going to speak today about several different types of tools. Unfortunately, saw a few people from outside of Kansas, and by necessity, I'm going to have to talk about things that are available in Kansas. There may be some comparable programs in your states, but at this point, I'm just going to have to deal with Kansas law, which is what I know and love. So there's really limited tools that are available for municipalities to help out a local grocery. And I'm going to speak to 4 of those. In Kansas, we have an Industrial Revenue Bond Act that is very robust in many respects. There is the ability to do community improvement districts that I'll speak to. There's always the ability to give money to a project. And lastly, we'll talk briefly about tax increment financing and how that might help a project as well. So industrial revenue bonds are available for cities or counties to issue. In Kansas, there are really 2 benefits. So as I said, they're very robust. There's many types of projects that can qualify for industrial revenue bonds. The problem with grocery is that it is obviously a retail establishment. Kansas law prohibits a retail property from being eligible for a property tax exemption. However, the project may still be financed with IRBs, industrial revenue bonds, for purposes of a sales tax exemption on all of the materials, all of the equipment going into construction of the facility. So as you can imagine, it can be a very valuable tool to have if you're exempting yourself from sales tax on all the racking, all of the freezing equipment, things like that. So industrial revenue bonds are a tool available for all types of projects, including retail. They just can't give a property tax exemption to this particular project. And in a structure of an industrial revenue bond, it's not a method of financing. It's not a method of giving money to the project. The city issues the bonds to make it eligible for the sales tax exemption. So typically now we will do a lease from the company that owns the land to the city. The city will then lease it back under a project lease, an IRB related lease, and it then can qualify for the sales tax exemption. The company itself typically will buy the bonds. So there really is no true financing involved. There's no money coming in through the bond issue from the city, but they still get the benefit of that sales tax exemption. So we'll move on to the next. In a typical transaction, again, company keeps title to the property. There's a lease back. Typically, then the IRBs are also issued at the end of the construction project. And that's so that all of the costs are known on making sure that you're including the total amount of the project in the costs of the project. The initial proceedings need to be done though up front. So before any money is spent, before anything is purchased, they need to be approached. The city needs to be approached. They need to be apprised of the situation. There is a public hearing. Sometimes it's not required if there's no property tax exemption, but there is an initial resolution then that the city will adopt that authorizes industrial revenue bonds to be issued. They'll come back then at the end of construction and actually take action through an ordinance to issue the bonds. The resolution at the beginning of the project allows the company to go to the Department of Revenue for Kansas and obtain a project exemption certificate. So it's really important that that step be done as early as possible before anything is purchased, because you're not getting sales tax reimbursed later. It's got to be an exemption that you use up front. So that's really the reason that industrial revenue bonds are ever involved in grocery stores. I've been involved in a handful of projects where they did use the industrial revenue bonds for the sales tax exemption. They're primarily, obviously, most valuable if it's new construction. And so it's something that could help. It could help on renovation as well, depending on what your purchases are. But I would say, just as a baseline, you want to make sure the project's at least $1 million or so to economically justify the cost of going through this process. So that's industrial revenue bonds. Next is community improvement districts. Community improvement districts are a very well-used tool. Not all cities will do them, but they're becoming more prevalent. And it's a method of adding a sales tax on to all purchases being made at a facility. And it can be as limited to the footprint of a building. So you may describe that the footprint of the new grocery store is going to be included within a district, and the district is created up front again to add a sales tax on. That sales tax may then be used to reimburse for expenses that we'll get into. So it's a great tool if there's not competition. We have done many of these for hotels because it's basically hidden cost that the hotel may collect, and then the reimbursement may go back to the hotel owner for virtually any cost. So construction of the facility, demolition, I've got on their streetscapes, everything. I mean, all of the exterior landscaping, signage, everything really to do with the cost of constructing the project may be included. Again, it has to be created up front before the improvements are made. So a typical community improvement district is formed by filing a petition to create the district. And then that petition will go through a process. There's a resolution that calls for a public hearing. You hold a public hearing 30 days later or so, and then may form the actual community improvement district. But again, it works great if there's very little competition. So on grocery, it's one of those where they have to just make the determination as to whether they want to bear an additional cost on that. So next slide. So as I mentioned, there is a petition filed, then there is a notice that is sent out, a hearing that is held. There are sales tax that may be implemented in increments of 10% or 0.25% up to 2% maximum. So it can go 2% for up to 22 years, or until you've reached the maximum of all of your reimbursable costs. That's a good problem to have. So the sales tax is just collected just like any other sales tax, and it can only start on the first day of a calendar quarter. So Jan 1, April 1, July 1, or October 1, the Department of Revenue wants at least 90 days advance notice in order to implement any portion of that. Again, we've done 1% taxes. We do a lot of 2% on businesses that can sustain having an additional tax. But the lion's share of the proceeds may be reimbursed to the developer of the project to cover costs of construction. So that can be a great tool. The state retains a small percentage of the collections for administrative. The city that implements it can also retain a small percentage for their administrative work. Then the rest of it would go back to the developer. That I've described is called a pay-as-you-go CID, where each time there's a collection, then a certain amount gets rebated back to the developer, paid to the developer. There are provisions that allow for bonds to be issued. I have not been involved in any CID bond issues. There are some provisions for special assessments as well, but the most applicable to this type of business, I think, would be to implement an additional sales tax if they can bear it. So that's community improvement districts. Next is city's ability to give money to a project. And I know you've had some case studies where cities have either issued some sort of financing or paid for the project. And excuse me, Cole will speak a little bit to some additional city incentives and funds that came into the Humboldt project. The city has the ability to issue home rule general obligation bonds and can give money to a project, or they can use that money to construct the project. If there's a developer involved or an operator involved, you generally will need to have some type of a development agreement that lays out the requirements of use of the proceeds, any restrictions that the city wants to impose. But it's basically, you know, if they have the ability or incentive to give money, there is an ability to be able to finance that if necessary. So you just need to look at, you know, the benefits again of whether the city will be able to bear the costs of donating money. If they issue any sort of general obligation bonds, that will be then a full faith and credit obligation of the city. And they have to come up with money either through taxes or any other source in order to repay the bonds that they have issued. So that's it's a big step for a city to go ahead and go out on a limb and just pay for it. So, but that is an option. Lastly, we'll talk about tax increment financing. I think a lot of states have some level of tax increment financing. It is a method of capturing the increased value in property taxes above a base level, and it can be then used to pay certain expenses for up to 20 years. Those expenses are very limited. It's got to be public infrastructure. It would be useful for any sort of a project where you've got to develop street improvements, curb cuts, things like that, or any sort of water, sewer, things like that. But it is the types of expenses are very limited. The types of eligibility are also fairly limited. You see, I have them listed there. The probably the most common would be that it qualifies as a blight, and that would just mean that it's an area that has deteriorated to the point where it's unsafe, it's dangerous, and so the city may declare that it's a blighted area. Another one is if the buildings are over 65 years old, that is another easy way to qualify. Another one is the enterprise zone exception. That has to be an enterprise zone that was created in 1992. So you have to go back and find maps, and state can help you with that process. But there's really limited eligibility on the actual district that can be formed. Then you could only use the proceeds for certain types of public infrastructure construction. So excuse me, again, it's going to be those kinds of water, sewer, streets. Does include a multi-sport athletic complex, probably not a big issue with a grocery store. And so the qualifications on use of the tax increment proceeds is fairly limited. The community improvement district, and on the other hand, is extremely broad. So that's why community improvement districts have been used more frequently than TIF in recent years. There can be bonds again issued to capture the TIF increment. And if you can, if you can find somebody to purchase them, then you can monetize it up front. Those again are relatively infrequent. Lastly, last slide is, again, it's an intensive process, multi-steps that you have to go through in order to establish a TIF district. And it can be vetoed by a school district or the county. So you have to have everyone on board. Yes, David, I'm from a law firm. So the the TIF isn't available incentive to offer under certain circumstances. And we have done one TIF in connection with a grocery store project. So they're pretty rare. That is the extent of my presentation. I'm going to turn it back to Erica and we'll listen to Cole.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was incredible. Lots of information. And I know it's very complicated. So I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today and really making it digestible for us. Thank you. So now we are ready to move on to our case study to see how a municipality supported its local grocery store. And today we're going to look at Humboldt, Kansas, and we're very excited to have the city administrator, Cole Herter, with us today to share that story. We just heard about various economic development tools from Sarah, but there are other things municipalities can do, in particular by having a person on staff who is committed to helping this project move forward, and serving as a connector is very, very vital. So once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we will have time at the end of today's webinar for Q&A. And with that, now I will turn it over to Cole.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here today. And as a city administrator, I really appreciate people like Sarah that can do the heavy lifting on some of that more complicated funding and financing. A little bit about myself. This is my hometown. This is kind of my second career. I became city administrator after being a management or staff level management in manufacturing for nearly 30 years. So I knew how to manage, but I didn't know much about city administration or economic development. Before I became city administrator, I did get involved with economic development and learned that my role, really in our role as a group in a small town, volunteers, we were connectors. And so a lot of the theme today that I'll talk about will be how we connected through the process to help the new store owners get on the right track. So we can go on to the next slide there. I'm telling this story a little bit in reverse, partly to get the tangible things up front for those of you who have questions about that, and also so that I can flex a little bit on the back end when we talk more about the store itself. But the city of Humboldt, just like any other city, we have challenges with our funding and amount of available cash for economic development, and really had not done any contributions for economic development other than some IRBs that happened several years ago. So during this process of starting this new store, the city did commit $20,000, which was a big kind of a leap for us because we hadn't done that before. And that was for the point of sale. The council felt like that they wanted to be able to see something or tag something that was tangible that they had contributed to. We did utility upgrades and improved the sewer or water and gas for the store. The store we're working on, or that we opened, is on the site of a previous store. Then we also offer neighborhood revitalization, and like Sarah, some of the my experience is in Kansas, so some of you that are not from here may or may not have similar programs. But neighborhood revitalization is a property tax rebate program that is in cooperation with all property taxing districts, the school district, the local community college, the county, and the city of Humboldt. And we have an interlocal agreement for a plan that if someone makes an improvement, the taxes on the improved value of the property are rebated. In our particular case, and these can be written a lot of different ways, our particular case is we give back 100% of the taxes for the first 6 years, and then decrement that 20% per year until in the 11th year they pay 100%. And they go ahead and make the payments. It is what it says. It's a rebate. So they make their payments when the taxes are due, and then we turn around and the county writes them a check back for that difference. And that is just on the improved value of the property. Allen County is the county we're in, and because of some other economic development they'd done, they'd actually committed funds to 2 previous grocery stores. There was a lot of talk about food deserts and the fact that small towns didn't have grocery stores, and they had committed to 2 previous ones. So I worked with the owners of the new store and the county to commit $80,000 for refrigeration upgrades, which was huge for them. Both the county and the city recognized that our return would happen in fairly short time, just simply through sales tax if we open the store. Next slide. So part of serving as a connector, one of the things we learned was we studied all the options for economic development, and we were bombarded with programs and acronyms and alphabet soup. And so one of our goals for our economic development business action team was to try to digest that and work with entrepreneurs to serve them and provide them the right connections. In this particular case, USDA, the Rural Energy Assistance Program was a grant program to help provide efficiency in whether it's insulation or new doors on the store or refrigeration, and that was another big piece of the financial program that we put together. Rural grocery initiatives, that's one of the first calls I made when I found out that we were going to need a new store, that the previous one had closed, and they were invaluable. They provided just a wealth of information that helped me get up to speed a lot quicker. I didn't know anything about grocery stores, except that's where I got my ice cream. The KHFI, Kansas Healthy Food Initiatives, was a big part of that. They provided funding and partnered with IFF, who ultimately funded the loan portion of this package we put together. And then the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and I'll explain a little bit later why they were very important part of this store that we opened. AWG, and this is going to vary by region. They are our region's largest supplier of the wholesale groceries in this area, and they have lots of resources and programs, and essentially in this particular group, they buy in as a membership, and then they get all these resources as part of that package. Kind of a secondary area is funding. Our business action team became an e-community, an entrepreneurial community through Network Kansas. And again, this probably is something that other states may have different forms of. Network Kansas is funded by tax credits, 75% tax credits for people that have a tax liability in Kansas, and they make a donation, and 75% of that comes back to them in the form of tax credits. The Network Kansas then uses those funds for really high-level training, things that we wouldn't have in rural Kansas if we had to pay to bring speakers and things to us. They also have several loan programs, and the one that I'm specifically involved in is the local one, which we loaned $45,000 to the new owners for 10 years at 2% for. I'm sorry, I wrote that wrong. It should be 5 years at 2%. Well, so I got that redundant there. So it's a 2% for 60 months. And that there are other programs, and if we go to the next slide, we can talk about some of those. That Network Kansas provides some additional funding above and beyond what we have capability of here locally. They have loan funds that can go all the way up to $250,000, and they have various like Women and Minority Business Multiplier and some other programs that fit more specific needs. And we work closely or do a handshake with Network Kansas to help build that funding package. So one more, yeah, there we go. So the we kind of went through a transformation through Food Desert and back. We had a store that was in existence, doing well, and the store owner had 2 other stores, and one of those stores closed and left him with a lot of debt, and the financial pressure was very hard to maintain with the remaining 2 stores, and eventually that took the store here locally down. Worked really hard with the owner to try to salvage it and make something happen. I was out in the store every week, watching and seeing how things were going, and things were just simply in decline. One of my thoughts was that maybe cash flow was an issue, and that if we could solve that cash flow. We also had a new grocery store 10 miles away. We had 2 Walmarts within 10 miles and 2 other grocery stores within 10 miles. And there was a Dollar General 2 blocks away. So all of those things, in addition to the difficulty with the business, the other store failing, just was incredible pressure on this local store for serving 1,800 people. So I discussed with the owner. He owned the building, and I said, if cash flow is a problem, and particularly if it's short term, would you be interested in selling the building if I could find a group of investors to buy the building and then lease the store back? And he was very interested in that. We went through that process. I actually found a single investor that was willing to make that investment and purchase the building, and lease that back. What I didn't know was the cash flow problem was a lot deeper than what I was privileged to know, and things just kept getting worse, and finally they closed within a few months. So they closed that store early 2019, and I shifted my efforts towards opening a new one, or finding a new buyer, a new owner that would run that store. And I didn't know anything about groceries, so I spent about 2 or 3 weeks creating this book called Humboldt Grocery Store, and RGI was integral to that. I got a lot of information from them. I looked at all kinds of models that were used across the nation. I looked at other brands, other chains, and there was a lot of things going on. So eventually I had this recollection of someone who had talked to me about a butcher shop and wanting to sell retail meats about a year before that. And so I called them. I'll get to that in a minute. I'll come back to that. But I learned that opening a grocery store takes a long time. The store was closed for over 2 years before it came open fully. They had a butcher shop that did open in the fall of 2020 and had limited business through that. And the store officially opened on July 8th, 2021, last year. If you go to the next slide, I think there's a picture of the headline for that out of our local paper. And then the next slide shows the ribbon cutting. And it's hard to pick out people, but we have county commissioners there, the mayor, the family that bought the store is Scott and Amy. Scott's there with the black cap on, and Amy's there with a black and red shirt, and their family. And we had local industry there, our biggest industry. So it just was a great day for Humboldt. Next slide shows a picture of the outside of the building, and they called it Our Market because they felt like it wanted to be a community market, a community the whole community could call ours. And part of the reason it took a while is just getting the funding together, and Scott and Amy both worked full time. They farmed and worked full time, and decided to rebuild the whole building. So if you'll turn to the next slide, it shows just one of the pictures, the many pictures I got of the inside being stripped completely bare and starting over. And what the thing that made this different than any other grocery store I know of is the next slide. If you look at the back of the building, those and the next slide, you see that there's some non-typical picture there with the corral and the cattle. Those are actually part of the building, and they slaughter the cattle. They bring them in live, slaughter them, hang them, butcher them, do all the butcher work, and then sell retail out the front of the store. So this was a model that we hadn't that I have not yet seen another model like this, although people don't usually advertise that they're slaughtering live animals right in the grocery store, but it was a really vertically integrated business option for them. If you go to the next slide, there's some pictures of the butcher with the hanging beef. Scott and Amy raise their own cattle and are starting to raise some of their own hogs, and then they buy hogs where they can, and then they also do custom butchering for probably a radius of 30 or 40 miles. On the next picture is a picture just of one of their counters with the butcher and grocery logo, and then the next picture shows their meat counter. When I went to Scott, well, Scott had come to me a year before, and that was another pressure I saw that was going to be on the local grocery, is he wanted to start a local retail meat market. And we just couldn't find the right building for him, and he couldn't justify building a new one. And so after I had researched groceries for 2 or 3 weeks, it finally occurred to me that maybe Scott and Amy would be interested, and they could have a place to sell their meat. And I called Scott and I said, "Hey, would you? I got a building for you." He says, "Great, where is it?" And I said, "Well, stop. There's a couple of strings attached. You're gonna have to sell milk and cereal and bread and potato chips." And one of the things I did with the previous store is I walked through, and when they stopped selling Doritos, I knew we were in trouble, because it just wasn't a grocery store without Doritos. But this has been very successful. Their meat is very high quality. An interesting thing is shortly after this, after we did this, this went through COVID. So COVID was another thing that slowed this whole process down. Just getting meat, the state inspectors, that's what the FDA or the Department of Ag was involved in, was helping them design their locker space and their slaughter area so that they would meet all the requirements. In Kansas, we have to have, for retail meat, the inspector has to be on site when they're butchering that meat. For the custom, they just come in and do inspections periodically. And so they cut retail meat 1 day a week, and then all the other custom happens on another day of the week. And both Amy and Scott are in the store every day. Amy teaches full time, and Scott is a loan officer at a bank, and also runs his cattle operation. I probably skipped over some things, but those are that's the main story here. If you want to go to the next slide, it just shows a picture of the storefront again. Oh, I guess that's there's the front. So the process was really we kind of did it our way. We didn't go into the things that Sarah talked about would have been great if we needed those funding options. Fortunately, we were able to get it through the loans and grants and things that were available. They just had their 1-year anniversary, and I talked with Amy, and she says, we're still not where we want to be. It takes a long time to start showing a profit, and so they're still working hard to make that work and figuring out what kind of things they can offer people to bring more business here. I think I've covered about everything that I was going to cover. If Erica, do you want to step back in and?
Yes, excellent, excellent, Cole. Thank you so much. Really interesting grocery model, as you said, with the butcher and the grocery kind of co-located. So we do have time now for questions from the audience. And Sarah, I'll bring you back here as well if you want to turn your video back on and unmute yourself. I do have a question for Cole first. And this was just a great story, Cole. Thank you again for being here to share it. But you know, you were so heavily invested in this project from beginning to end. You worked with the previous owner while they were still there. You helped find the new grocery owners in your community because you had a conversation, you remembered Amy and Scott, and they came to mind. You helped identify different financial resources. You helped facilitate that building purchase. You learned all about grocery operations. You were really, really heavily involved and, you know, put the pieces together. So I was just wondering if you can kind of share why you were so invested in this project. Of all projects that you could have been working on, what did this project mean for the city of Humboldt, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a long answer. So I'll try to break through it, but about 2005 or so, Humboldt was really in decline. We were going to lose our grocery store then, before it was taken over again. We lost our newspaper. We had churches were closing, and we just were on a downslide. And we had there was embezzlement at the city level. This was before I was here. And so things were just really going down. And we started a process of community conversation with a consultant that came in and helped us talk through where we wanted to be. What did we do well, and how can we use the things we did well to teach us to do other things better? And that was several years. That was 7 years or so before I became city administrator. So I had been involved for a long time prior to my job. This is my hometown. I love what I do. I love working here. And I think makes all the difference in the world if you like what you're doing. And I learned at previous jobs that just the short answer is I always ask myself before I start anything is, how do you know what you don't know? And I know that every time I start something that's new, there's something there that I don't know about. So I try to make sure I check those boxes and make sure that I research those things. And so that's kind of what happened on this project. I didn't even know what I didn't know when I started. And I have a note thing here. It's totally unrelated. I hadn't planned to talk about it, but it says, figure it out and learn how it can be as important as know how. And so those are sort of some things I kind of guides me daily on how you figure, how do you go through these processes. But I wasn't going to become a food desert. Another thing I'd watched is Iola, Kansas, 10 miles north of here, had lost their grocery store, their primary grocery store, when they got a new Walmart supermarket, or the big store with the groceries. And they worked for 10 years to get a grocery store back. And I knew I knew how big of a task this was. And the longer we were without a grocery store, the harder it was going to be to get back. So the first answer was, how do you salvage what you have? It's kind of like employees. How do you retain the ones you have? Because it's always easier and less costly to keep the ones you have than to get new ones. And so same with the grocery store. But as time went on that fall, I knew that transition was going to happen, but I couldn't let myself think about it because I owed it to the previous owner to help him salvage what he had. So I think just one of the things we learned in our business action team about 10 years ago when we started it was that we looked at all our businesses here in a small town, and the successful ones were the ones that had a tie to the community. They were owned or operated by people that had grown up here and graduated here. They weren't the ones we recruited from someplace else. And so I knew that we couldn't count on bringing a grocery brand in that had stipulations of 30,000 cars a day or whatever, because we were just going to be a business center for them and not part of the community.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, that is so important, as you're saying, the local connection. I also just want to point out, Ryle just added in the chat that Humboldt has been listed as one of the top 52 places to visit by the New York Times. So that's pretty
awesome.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
That we got there's been a lot of hype this year. We got that early in the year, and then we've been in the Kansas City Star, Wichita Eagle this a couple months ago, and it's been kind of humbling. And a lot of that work, we have another group in town that is revitalizing the downtown, and so we're working on a lot of things all at the same time, and so there's a lot of energy in this. That really helps too. Someone had a question about IRR. I'm trying to think what I said that was reflective of IRR.
I wonder if they meant IFF.
Okay,
that what
IFF.
you
Yeah, and
meant?
I didn't put that in a slide because I was sort of arm's length from IFF. Can you talk about that, Erica or Ryle?
I can say a little bit. So IFF is a community development financial institution, and they partner with the Kansas Healthy Food Initiative to provide financing for healthy food retail projects. And Amber Korf joining us today on the webinar. She just posted a link to their website in the chat, so you can learn more about them, or you can go to kansashealthyfood.org as well for the Kansas Healthy Food Initiative website. Well, I do want to get a question here for Sarah as well. Sarah, the economic development tools that you provided can be very complicated. So I kudos to you for sharing all of that information in just 20 minutes. That is quite a feat. And this webinar is really intended to just give people that basic, fundamental information about those tools. But I know that there's a lot more to it. So where should people go for help with these different economic development tools that you shared today? How would a city or a county get started working with a firm that has this kind of expertise?
They really just need to reach out to one of the few municipal finance firms in the state. Department of Commerce is a great resource initially, but as Erica mentioned, yes, I did not intend to make you experts and be able to do this yourself. But again, our firm's been doing this over 40 years and I've been doing it over 20. So it is more, you've got to follow the steps correctly. And we would love to just be able to discuss how some of these tools could help you. So I think, Erica, you wanted us to put our emails in the chat, and I'll do so, but is there anything specific other than, Department of Commerce, reach out to any municipal finance firm, your city attorney may know of someone. So those would be resources I'd look to.
Great. Yes, thank you. And as Sarah just mentioned, yeah, Cole and Sarah, if you can put your contact information in the chat, then if people have follow-up questions, they know how to reach you. A question here for Cole. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that the city provided $20,000 for the point of sale system. The county provided $80,000 for refrigeration upgrades. I was wondering if you could talk about what that process was like. I imagine there was a vote, but was there any other sort of engagement involved in any of this?
Yeah, this went on over several months, and it was a process of balancing things in the right order. Not having been through that before, and also waiting for USDA, because you can only apply for the REAP grant certain times of the year, and one time is a better part time to, so there was a primary and a secondary time to apply. So we had to line those all up and and bring estimates and things. So we were trying to figure out how much REAP was going to pay for and how much the county could pay for. And commissioners had changed since the other two groceries received funds, and they were more willing to commit to those. As a membership on the commission, only two out of three commissioners, two had changed. And so it was an interesting process when they had, there's some taxpayers that push back and say that's not a good use of taxpayer money to fund a private for-profit business. And so we had to justify that through the fact that sales tax was going to pay off in 4 years for the county, and actually within a year for the city. The city didn't have a lot of pushback. It was mostly at the county level, because there were community people from 30 miles away that didn't shop in Humboldt, that didn't see that a good use of their money. Like I said, they kind of wanted to see something tangible. They didn't just want to hand over a check and say, go spend it the way you want. They wanted to see something that we actually partnered with the supplier and sent a check directly to the partner, or to the supplier, and from the city. I don't know if did that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience?
Erica might comment. One thing that I use too is a little bit is I ran across in my research, it's not real prevalent, but there was some discussions in areas that considered groceries availability to healthy food as starting to lean towards the infrastructure side of things. So I used the language of infrastructure a few times when I talked about this, and said, we are responsible for healthy water, safe water, and sanitary sewer, and removing trash. Well, we're also starting to see cities, and there were municipal cities here in Kansas already starting to buy and own grocery stores. And I said, I'm not willing to take that leap to own and operate a grocery store from the city. So I think it's only fair for us to contribute in a smaller way, and help make sure that this happened right in the middle of COVID too, which helped a little bit, because we had people leaving our town and driving 10 miles to mix with people from other towns in their grocery stores, and would have been so much nicer if we weren't exchanging visits to and from cities 10 miles away, and just spreading that virus. So there were a lot of arguments during that time that kind of were compelling to help out.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very strong talking point, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I think we have time for one more question.
I had one more question that I wanted to ask of Sarah. So of the tools that you shared, are there particular tools that can be used when a grocery store might be part of a larger project, maybe sort of a downtown revitalization project, or sort of a series of improvements that the community wants to make? Which, I think I might know kind of which one you'd suggest, but which one do you think a community should hone in on if there is sort of a big picture strategic plan that includes a grocery store, includes a variety of updates to the community that they might be able to use some of these municipal financing tools?
Sorry about that. Certainly the tax increment finance would spring to mind first if it can apply, because that can be part of the overall project. And there's been some good sized tax increment finance projects that have been handled over the years. The other is, I mean, you can always use these industrial revenue bonds just for the sales tax exemption. That's a relatively easy, it's not cheap, but it's an easy method of assisting. And then lastly, you know, if you want to do an overlay of a community improvement district, that can go up to 2 cents for all sales, and that can be a great money generator as well. So all of them.
Great,
right.
thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. And then I also want to call out Stuart Reed with the Food Co-op Initiative said in the chat, cities that have received ARPA funding have sometimes granted part of those funds to help open a needed grocery store, significant amounts. So you could also take a look at that as well. All right, well, we're at 2:30, so I'm just going to quickly wrap this up today. Thank you so much, Cole and Sarah, for being here, sharing your expertise with us and your experience. We truly appreciate all that you do, and thank you again. As always, we have a survey at the end of the webinars so that we can learn what you need, what you still want to learn about. We only have 2 more webinars remaining this year, but your feedback really helps us. So I just put a link to that survey in the chat, and it should just take 1 minute to fill it out. So thank you for doing that. And then I just wanted to quickly preview our next webinar on November 17th. We will be looking at other community-supported grocery ownership models. We have seen communities get really creative and come up with their own innovative solutions. And those solutions include many different partners and leaders in the community. So we'll be looking at that next month, and we hope to see you there. So once again, thank you, Sarah and Cole. Thank you, everyone in attendance today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.